Let me begin perhaps by just asking you a personal question about liberty and your interest in political liberty and so forth. How did that begin for you? How did you start?
Well, it began with historical work that I was doing when I was writing my first book, which was called The Foundations of Modern Political Thought. I was working on questions about Renaissance moral and political philosophy, and came upon some ideas that really, frankly, puzzled me, because I was assuming, I see now, that there would be great continuity in thinking about questions about freedom and citizenship. And there weren't, because I was coming upon a view which suggested that you could not be a free citizen unless you were a politically engaged citizen. So something was being strongly affirmed, especially in a writer like Machiavelli in the Discorsi, which seemed the opposite of what our intuitions would be, which is that freedom should be thought of mainly in terms of rights. And fundamental rights include rights to be left alone, so far as is compatible with a good legal order, getting on with one's life in the way that one chooses. So the notion that freedom would involve action which would not be strongly chosen action, but would be almost obligatory, was a paradox that I came upon and couldn't at that time properly resolve.
When you first saw this, did it make you think of the ideology of Roman times immediately? Did you think of Cicero and the sense that it's the duty of any highborn or at least sufficiently capable free citizen of Rome to be participating in the welfare of his state? Did that come to your mind immediately, or did it take a little bit longer before?
Well,
or did it not come that way at all?
It should have come that way, and I certainly looked to antiquity because they were all looking to antiquity, but I looked in the wrong place. What I thought I was bound to be driven back to was an Aristotelian understanding of citizenship, in which, to paraphrase very strongly, Aristotle wants us to suppose that human nature has an essence, and I suppose we don't completely disagree with that. We talk about actions as inhuman and so forth. But this human essence, for him, was political. So, as he says in the famous phrase, man is the political animal. And so I thought that what I was reading was a revival of this idea that there is a kind of essence to human nature, that the essence is political. And then the strong claim, which is almost on the edge of sense, that what it is to be a free person, especially what it is to be a citizen, is to realize those capacities, to realize those particular powers, because those are your distinctively human powers.
Right. So the potentiality of what it means to be human, according to this definition.
Exactly. So that freedom comes to be seen as the name of a kind of moral achievement where you have it in you to become something, and the free person is the person who realizes those potentialities. Now that's recognizably a Greek way of thinking about the relationship of potentiality to power, and of course, that's also a view of freedom which is at large in our own day, and I think that must have helped me to go on the wrong track, because when I was growing up, the philosopher who, above all, had made their view about freedom was Hannah Arendt, especially in the essays in Between Past and Future, when she talks about freedom and politics. And for her, freedom just is politics. That's to say, the democratic project of people being thoroughly engaged as citizens is an instantiation and a declaration of freedom. So I started to think that that was what I was confronting. But the more I read, the more I saw that the claim that was being made was a causal claim. And that seemed, in a way, more intuitive when I thought about it, which was, the claim seemed to be, if you want to remain free as a citizen, then it's a causal condition of the maintenance of that freedom that you should actively participate in the life of your community.
Of course, that's not such an unusual thing from Machiavelli to be,
not at all.
To be be
Quite
saying, given his circumstances.
That's right. Well, of course, it is a view about the relationship of freedom to self-government. So the second phase in my interest in these questions arose when I was invited to give something called the Tanner Lectures at Harvard University. And this was very shortly after I'd published my first book, which came out in 1978. So I must have been asked to give these lectures sometime in the very early 1980s. I delivered them in 1984, I think. And I gave a series of lectures called The Paradoxes of Political Liberty, in which I offered this kind of Stoic paradox that freedom was seen as service. And I tried to work through the causal account of that I'd arrived at. But I wasn't very satisfied with that. I didn't think it was wrong, but it had left me feeling that I hadn't really understood what the underlying view of freedom was. So then I went on to other phases of my research, and I didn't come back to this question until sometime later when I was working again on Renaissance thought. And that was in the early 90s, and I had a great stroke of luck at that time, which was that I was at the Australian National University on a research fellowship. And an old friend of mine, Philip Pettit, who now teaches at Princeton University, was then in the Research School of Social Sciences and was working on questions about freedom. And he and I taught a seminar together. And I would want to say that I think it was Philip who had the insight completely squarely that I had been casting around for some time before, which was that what makes sense of all of these things that I've so far said is that when these Republican writers of the Renaissance and early modern period talk about freedom, they just don't mean anything like how we would understand the concept. Now, of course, an historian should have been having that insight, and I could see that it wasn't fitting together. But Philip supplied a version of what I've come to think is fundamental to this, as I want to call it, Neo-Roman way of thinking about freedom. And that was to say that whereas for us the natural way of thinking about political liberty, civil freedom in any kind, is to think of it as de facto, that's to say, are you now free to do something or to refrain from doing it, is simply a question about whether anyone else is interfering with your exercise of your powers. So it's de facto just in the sense that if no one is stopping you from doing something, right, and if you have the power to do that thing, if you also choose to do it, that's a free choice and the resulting action is a free action. So that's a very natural way for us to think about freedom. In fact, it's the standard way we think about freedom. The writers I was studying were not thinking about freedom in that way at all. Now, Philip Pettit wrote a brilliant book, and now a classic, published in 1997, the same year that I published my little book called Liberty Before Liberalism. His was called Republicanism. And he proposed a view which wasn't quite the view that I eventually wanted to put forward, but it helped me tremendously on my way, which was that we should distinguish freedom understood as non-interference, as he wanted to call it, from freedom understood as non-domination. So he wanted a very strong symmetry between two different ways of thinking about negative liberty. They're both ways of thinking of liberty as a negative concept, by which I think we mean simply that the presence of freedom is always recognizable by an absence. So the liberal understanding of freedom is that the absence that always marks the presence of freedom is absence of, as he wants to say, interference. Whereas the presence that marks the absence of liberty understood in what he calls Republican terms would be absence of domination. Now, I understand, because of course Philip is a philosopher rather than an intellectual historian, that he liked very much this symmetry, and he wanted to bring the two stories strongly together while contrasting them. It seemed to me, and writing about the issue at the same time as I was doing in my little book, that actually the contrast was very dramatically much wider than that formulation might lead one to think. And that really what the writers I was finding in the Renaissance and then back to Roman as opposed to Greek antiquity wanted to say is, to put it anachronistically for a moment, that freedom should not be understood as a predicate of actions essentially, at all. Freedom is the name of a status. That's what they wanted us to understand. And their emphasis was not on whether I'm free to do this or that. Of course, that was important to them. But what was fundamental to them was, do you have the status of being a free person? That's the question they're asking. And once I saw that, I was taken back into the most formative text of all for this way of thinking about freedom, which is the Roman law. The Roman law begins by wanting to set up a distinction between two sorts of persons. Because it is a law code, it is asking who is subject to law. Now, it's also a slave society, so not everyone is subject to law. Only citizens are subject to law. So the question for them, since a citizen is free ex hypothesi, by contrast with being a slave, is what makes a slave a slave? Because if you understand what makes a slave, you will understand what it is to be a free person, because to be a free person is not to be a slave, right. Exactly. So the answer that's given in the Roman law to what it is to be a liber homo, as they say, using a word we don't have in the English language, homo, meaning man or woman, what it is to be a free man or woman is, just as you would expect, it is not to be dependent upon the arbitrary will of anyone else. Because what it is to be a slave is exactly to be wholly dependent upon the arbitrary will of somebody else. Now, that's a very deep thought about freedom, because it gets round a paradox which liberal political philosophy often gets into, which is, if freedom is simply absence of interference, what makes the slave unfree? Because there could be a slave who, because the master is benign or absent, is not interfered with in what he or she chooses to do. So what makes them a slave? Right. But it's not a puzzle. It's only a puzzle if you
look at it from that context.
Exactly. You've made it into a puzzle by giving what this tradition would think is a very shallow analysis of the concept of freedom, making it exclusively a predicate of actions, whereas what you should think of is that it's fundamentally about a human status, and it's the status of not being a dependent.
And that brings up what I interpret, reading your works, as a key point, which is to say, to embed this sense of freedom within a larger society. And from that is to say, if you just look at freedom as being liberated from or reduced from any external constraints, this notion of almost a naturalistic way of looking at it.
Oh, absolutely.
That okay, you're not holding me or you're not binding
absolutely.
Me, and so that I can go off in my particular direction. One can imagine freedom being defined independent of whatever the state happens to be, because there are laws, and the laws are
Definitely.
Created somehow in some abstract context, and then one is either free or not free depending on those particular that evaluation of that specific criterion. But if you look at it in this sense of what it means somehow to be a free person,
yes,
that it seems to me naturally, and my thoughts, I hope you agree with them, because they're based largely on my interpretation of what you wrote, so you should actually agree with them. But my understanding is that this means that one is looking at the status of people as being free or not free vis-a-vis their societal
absolutely.
Status, and thus you can start making claims that have some degree of sense, some degree of semantic content as to what a free state is or is not.
This is absolutely fundamental. I could put your point the other way around and say that once I'd come to this realization, it seemed to me that there is something very strange, indeed even fantastical, about the way that contemporary liberal political philosophy has set up the question of freedom and the state. So if you take the kind of liberal political theory that moves in a very strongly libertarian direction, as it tends to do in contemporary American political theory, then to take a classic instance, Robert Nozick's book of 1974, Anarchy, State and Utopia, begins with the individual who is a possessor of rights. And this person's freedom, of course, is a right and the means to other rights. Now, freedom is understood in that text as absence of coercion. So let's now think about the state. How does a state characteristically act It doesn't usually limit our freedom by, as you say, physically taking hold of us. So there may be a moment, of course, in a court of law where you're handcuffed and someone has taken away your freedom of movement. But that's not, of course, the paradigm of how states operate. The paradigm is that states have laws, and laws have penalties attached to the breach of those laws, and the aspiration of the legislature is to make you more frightened of the consequences of disobedience than of the proneness to disobedience that you might otherwise have. So that bends the will, as Jeremy Bentham liked to put it, and a bending of the will is obviously a limiting of choice. So there is your freedom being taken away. So in the way that it's set up in this liberal model, the state is the immediate and automatic enemy of freedom, because freedom is absence of coercion, but the state is a coercive apparatus.
Right.
And so there's a continual disposition, which Nozick illustrates very well through his book, of this kind of liberal political theory to become anarchist. Because thinking now about the state, the first thing you're likely to think is, well, is that a legal institution at all? Because freedom is a fundamental value for me. It's a right and a means to rights.
And they're taking it away.
And they're taking it away. But that is a fantasy of the way that we should set up thinking about freedom, because actually most of what we talk about when we talk about rights presupposes the state. And the power of this completely different alternative way of thinking about freedom and what's fundamental about it is that we are in the state.
Otherwise, we're in this state of nature, as it were. So.
Well, yes, we're in a fantasy state of nature. Right. It's not a sociological condition, it's just a thought experiment. A thought experiment,
exactly.
Yes.
Right.
Now, I do want to say something where I'm likely to be misunderstood, because you pick it up very beautifully in your comments. I am not sitting here in order to tell you that if you now handcuff me, you haven't taken away an element of my freedom. Of course not. So if we were to get up from our conversation and find that this door was locked, then we would not be free to leave the room. We would have the power, but somebody unknown to us has taken that power away. Of course, we're unfree to leave, whereas we had that power counterfactually, so it's been taken away from us. What the writers I'm interested in want to say is, well, we're not denying that. What we're denying is that that's what's fundamental about freedom. That's making it a predicate of actions, but it's the name of a status. Fundamentally, it's not a predicate of actions. Right. It's the name of a status.
So, you've had this breakthrough in your understanding. You've had this epiphany, as it were. And from your writings, one of the things that I could gauge that captivated me was, notwithstanding this clear penetration of what these Renaissance authors were saying and how that was linked to the classical view. These ideas, although they cropped up in various different incarnations over the ages, over history, eventually were replaced by our classical liberal understanding. And so it was as if there was this, if one looks historically, it was as if there was this war going on, as it were, between two fundamental ideas of freedom. One as this basic predicate to action, as you were saying, and the other is more in this sense of almost naturalistic, physical, inhibitory sense of your freedom. And there are times when this Neo-Roman or Republican view, this predicate to action view, was to the fore, and that, of course, was that had arisen through historical circumstances in the English Civil War. There were people who were advocating this sense as a way of justifying the elimination of the monarchy and the Republican movement, and then so you chart this throughout history, and you draw links between these two different streams, and the claim is that that eventually this classical liberal view of freedom really being represented by an impediment to action was victorious, and in fact it was so victorious that it and you quote Isaiah Berlin at some point, that it was as if it was impossible to even contemplate any other view of that. So I wanted to ask you, Well, first of all, is that a fair depiction before I go on, or am I missing something?
No, I think that's a very fair outline. It seems to me, let me respond a little bit to exactly that point, that the history, as I see it, is one of very strong contestation in the early modern period, and the gradual disappearance as a candidate for thinking about freedom of the Neo-Roman view that it's the name of a status, and its replacement by the, as it were now, liberal understanding of freedom as simply non-interference with actions. Yes, there is an historical story to be told about that, and that is roughly how I see it.
So I'm reading this, and I think, I'm not a political philosopher. I don't even know very many political philosophers. Quentin Skinner tells me that this view is the triumphant view, and this is the way that people now regard freedom in this space. And I think, well, hang on a minute. If I turn on CNN or if I turn on the news, people will talk in such a way as if they are very often equating political freedom with democracy.
Yes.
With this notion of how a state is being governed. So in that sense, it seems to me that it's not my understanding that at least as the men on the street, there is a clear link between our sense of freedom and a particular type of government. I mean, again,
yes.
let me just back up and see if I can phrase
yes.
things correctly according to what I understand. So the classic liberal understanding is, look, government makes the laws.
Yes.
It doesn't really make any difference how the laws are being made in terms of our definition of freedom. Government makes the laws. These are the laws which define our freedom in terms of whether or not we conform with those laws or whether we don't, or as Hobbes would say, whether we form a covenant with these particular laws, whether yes. we buy into these laws. And insofar as we allow these laws to constrain us, then we are limiting our freedom vis-a-vis these particular laws, and we all live in society with these laws. And that's what it means to be free. It's not this sense of whether we are free by disposition or free within the sense of a free state or anything like that. It's just our sense of being free with respect to these laws. But again, and that claim, as I understand it, has been sufficiently successful in terms of its acceptance that people even question how you can look at freedom in any other way. So if that's yes. the claim, then I say, okay, well, hang on, I turn on CNN, and they're saying things like, we have to make the world safe for democracy, and yes. this is the only way to protect your freedom. And we look at other states around the world, at least we not being political philosophers, which was how I opened this, but the general public, we do make this equivalence between a sense of freedom and a particular form of government.
Yes.
So maybe it's not as... Maybe at least in the worlds I travel in, it's not quite as universally accepted.
Yes, that's very interesting. I would certainly want to say that you're absolutely right to stress that a distinction between, let me call it the liberal view, it's a slight parody, by contrast with the Neo-Roman view, is that the former is not very interested in the relation of liberty to forms of government, and the latter thinks that there is one canonical form of government, namely democracy, which alone delivers freedom. Now, what I'm struck by in talk about the relations of freedom and democracy in this country is that the freedom which is prized is the freedom to be left alone to do what you want. And democracy is prized as a form of government that will enable that to happen. So he governs best who governs least. So it's a democratic framework, but the aspiration that people have within that framework is to maximize their freedom of action. Now, what solved for me the problem that I started out with in my research all those years ago, just to recapitulate it, that I was reading people who were saying, unless you are yourself active in the political sphere, this will be dangerous to your own liberty. These are the real Democrats, because what they're saying is there's a canonical form of government which is self-government, and the reason that that alone secures your freedom is, don't forget that what your freedom is not being subject to arbitrary power as a member of a civil association. Now, how can you minimize arbitrary power? Well, only by making, in some way, the law be a reflection of your will, or at least of your represented will. If you can see in the law either your will or a representation of it, then in obeying the law, you are obeying your will. And so there's a sense in which you are free in obeying the law, namely that it's the law that you think there should be.
It's your law.
It's your law. So autonomos. The Greek gives it all. You're giving the law to yourself. That's what it is to be autonomous. You give the law to yourself. Right. Now, within what political framework can you give the law to yourself? Only a framework in which you are able actively to participate, or to participate by representation, in a deliberative and representative series of assemblies which are the sole source of law. That alone does it. So that is why in the Roman Republican and then in the Renaissance Republican understandings of the state, what you have to see is that it's this view of freedom which is being claimed requires a particular state. So what exact state, one might then ask, does it require? And they're very clear. It has to have two conditions attached to it. One is only law must rule. There must be no discretionary powers. There must be no executive powers that can simply be invoked.
Right.
There must be no royal prerogative where the will of the monarch suddenly becomes the law. All discretionary powers are arbitrary because they're somebody's will, but they have to be my will or my represented will. So they are all excluded. They enslave. So only the laws rule. And secondly, as I've already said, I must be able to see my will in the law.
Right.
So what this mandates is a particular form of very active democratic citizenship as a condition of upholding freedom, but not as a condition of upholding freedom as being left alone to do whatever I want. The freedom that is being upheld is freedom from arbitrary power.
Right.
Because if you're not free from arbitrary power, you don't have freedom in the absolutely fundamental sense. And yes.
So I was just going to say, this is a point that you highlight, I think, very clearly, because this arbitrary power doesn't actually have to be used. It just has to exist in potential that it could be used. Mm. And there seems to be a sense from your writings that if it exists in potential, that to some degree rots the society from within, because then you get these sycophants, you get these courtiers in a monarchy. You have people who are, and one can imagine something similar happening in a democracy. If something could be perverted, if the laws could be perverted according to arbitrary will,
yes,
then you have this superstructure in the society, which threatens to, which I guess by this definition threatens the freedom of individuals.
This is absolutely right, and I think this is really fundamental. Another way of putting this, and it brings out the contrast that I'm interested in between the liberal understanding and this other way of thinking about it, is to insist that freedom is not de facto. Earlier in our conversation, we were saying the liberal view is that freedom is a de facto idea. The question is somebody now stopping you from doing something? If you're not, and it's a power of yours, then you're free to do it.
Right.
What the other theory is trying to get you to see is the hidden operations of power to constrain us. They are not de facto. These hidden operations of power don't actually have to operate for us to be less free. And I think to make that clear, I ought to say a little bit more about how this notion of not being subject to arbitrary power fills out. Because what they want to say about the person who is subject to the arbitrary will of somebody else is, well, first of all, this person is a slave. That is what the Roman writers want to say. So that would for us be a metaphor. We're not talking about chattel slavery, but we are talking about what these writers would speak of as living like a slave in certain domains of your life. Now, how do they make that rather melodramatic claim come good? The answer is in two ways. I mean, first is a kind of metaphysical point, but it's one that's very important. If you are dependent on somebody else's will, it doesn't even have to be the case that you're aware of that. This is a point you've just made. That's absolutely fundamental. You could be a slave without knowing it. So, for example, in a slave society, you could be born a slave. You don't know you're a slave, but you are. Now, it's perfectly true that you couldn't be a slave for long in any domain of your life without coming to see that. But the first point that they want to make is that in that existential condition, no action of yours is ever freely performed. Because an action freely performed in our ordinary way of thinking about this way is an action performed according to your will. And a free choice is the choice that you will. Of course, this may all be determined, and we're not talking here about determinism, but it's a compatibilist view that the experience of having these capacities to choose is existential. So the first thought is that's one criterion for being able to choose and act freely. And it's not merely necessary, it's sufficient. Now, if you are subject to arbitrary power, there's always going to be a second criterion for you being able to act, which is that the person with arbitrary power to stop you has chosen not to exercise that arbitrary power. Right. It's always there. They could always exercise it.
And it's their choice.
And it's their choice. And they can exercise that choice with impunity, and there's nothing you can do about it. Mm. So when you act, you have this illusion of freedom, which is actually based upon the non-exercise of hidden power. And what I want to alert us to in our own society is the extent to which there are these hidden powers. That sounds paranoid, but that there are these arbitrary powers which mean that much of what we do is only done with permission. So I'm trying to see freedom entirely at its foundation as a question about how to avoid arbitrary power. And if we go back to the model of the politics that this would generate, notice that it would be a politics in which each person is, by the state, which would have to help to do this, liberated from exercise of arbitrary power within their lives. So some of these forms of arbitrary power have got much worse during my own lifetime. And one very important instance is the deunionization of workforces in the name of something called the free market. So there is a notion of freedom, but it's not the one that I'm talking to you about this afternoon. If you completely deunionize, of course, you can get more efficient workforces, but what you're also doing is making those workforces completely dependent upon you. So now consider the plight of migrant workforces, which may often also be people who are illegally in the country in which they are working. What chance have they of a decent wage? What chance have they of negotiating their wage? None at all. They're completely dependent upon someone who offers them work, and if they don't want it, then there's no negotiation about the terms of it. It seems to me that it is a shocking fact that in the name of freedom, we have increased dependence, because on my account, to increase dependence is to diminish freedom. One of the powers of the theory that we're talking about this afternoon is that it connects freedom extremely strongly to equality. It says what it is to be a free citizen is to be equally free with all other citizens, to be able to have this sense of belonging such that I feel that the law is a representation of my will. It isn't, of course, literally my will, and I may be in a minority, but if I'm in a minority and I feel that the structure is right, I feel, well, you can't win everything. But I've got to be able to see my represented will in the law, and so have you. So we are equal citizens. We have equal rights in respect of the direction of the polity. Now, that is to say that we are instantiating freedom as non-dependence. But it is also to say that a political society that instantiates that value has instantiated social justice. Because what is social justice except the equal freedom of citizens in that way?
So let me be devil's advocate and pick up on this point in terms of social justice. Let's imagine a state where, which is fully democratic, and we can say that the will of the people is such that everyone can feel that they are responsible for crafting the laws. It is their laws broadly defined. And let us imagine this is in the contemporary United States of America, where you happen to reside. But the laws that are arrived at, these particular laws that are arrived at through this democratic and open process, are that all intellectual historians shall be sent off to the gulags. So this does not strike me as a law which incorporates a very large measure of social justice, not only because I like intellectual historians, but just because I am appealing to a higher sense of,
Yes.
of justice that goes beyond the so-called tyranny of the majority and so forth.
Of course.
But in your view, or at least in this view of what it means to be free in a state where everyone has an equal role, these laws are passed. They can't be seen to be arbitrary according to one monarch who has decreed this. Can I really define social justice this way? Because this seems a counterexample. Do you understand where I'm going with this?
I absolutely understand it. And it raises a very big question for anyone who started to take this way of thinking about freedom and therefore equal citizenship at all seriously. What institutions would we need to design to deliver this kind of equal freedom? The problem that democracy constantly faces is majoritarianism. Majoritarianism, of course, can be an enemy of freedom in the way that we're talking about. And your fantasy example would, of course, be particularly disturbing for me. So the short answer to your doubt is, of course, the problem that we all face as Democrats, which is that prima facie democracy is simply a majoritarian creed, and we mustn't let it be so. So what are we saying? We are saying that the ideal constitution that would deliver freedom in the form I'm talking about it, and thus social justice, would have to have institutions that were not elective institutions. It would have to have agreed but non-elective supervising legal institutions which could do something to mitigate those dangers.
And represent minority rights in this case, or the rights of the individuals?
That's the great issue, how to represent minority rights under a majoritarian system. And in this country, the Constitution is actually rather sensitive to that, less so in my country. But of course, if we were now designing the ideal constitution, that's one of the first things we would have to think about. Now, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but of course, one of the things that I've come to feel strongly in my recent thinking about this way of talking about freedom and social justice is we probably need a very different constitution. We probably need to think again about central features of our constitution and what kind of a freedom we are trying to instantiate.
Let me pick up on the comment that you made about going off the rails a little bit and extrapolate from there to another comment that you had made towards the end of Liberty Before Liberalism, and you talk about how you see your job, the role of an intellectual historian. And you mentioned that the analogy that you chose was this analogy of being an archaeologist of ideas, of great intellectual ideas, some of which, hence the archaeology reference, some of which might have been cast aside or thrown by the wayside or forgotten or left over. And you look at it as an aspect of your job to examine these ideas, to dust them off, as it were, to bring them to light. And it seems to me that serves two purposes. One is to reassess these ideas in a contemporary view, or with given our understanding of subsequent events that have happened over the centuries, because maybe there's something to them, after all. And the other aspect is that it might force us to rethink not only our fundamental assumptions, but even our level of awareness that we have made such assumptions. That's one of the things that happens, of course, when you start making assumptions. You don't even realize that you're making assumptions.
Yes.
Do you still look at yourself that way? Is that an accurate
Yes, it's part of how I see myself. I suppose that I also want to try to make sure that I'm not being Philistine about the task of the historian. And I want to associate myself with the view that it would be Philistine to suppose that the point of the past is to help us in some completely utilitarian way. It is to enlarge our imaginations and to enable us to walk through many buildings where we learn things all the time, to get out of ourselves, to get out of our own society, to think in larger ways about all these works of the human spirit. So that all sounds like a pile of cliches, and it is, but we've somehow got to face those cliches and make something of them. And I say that because my work, insofar as it's been about political and moral theory, has commonly been denounced as antiquarian. That's to say, I'm very interested in the history of moral and political philosophy, but I'm not interested in the history because I think that it's talking about what we talk about now. And it's a very common assumption in certain parts of our intellectual community that the value of the past is at best a mirror. And we look into the past and we see ourselves, and we see questions that we still ask, and maybe it might be interesting to formulate that question as they did, but basically we're using these people to help us with our questions. As Derek Parfit once beautifully put it, we're grave robbers. And I am not interested in being a grave robber. I think that the sensibility of the historian is to try to study the past insofar as we can manage, and of course there are huge philosophical questions attached to this, but in its own terms, and try to see it from their point of view. If we do that, then, what I think we do find is exactly what you've said, is that in our modern culture, and perhaps also in antiquity, we find many paths not taken. And we tend to write the history as the history of the winners. We write wars as the history of the winners, but we also write the history of our culture as the history of the winners. But did the winners always deserve to win? Is a huge question that historians ought to have at the forefront of their mind if they're working on anything which is a product of the human spirit and intelligence. So we've talked a lot today about a particular way of thinking about freedom, where I think that we're not the winners. We lost sight of something, and it's quite easy to provide strong historical explanations of why we lost sight of a particular way of thinking about freedom and citizenship. But it is deeper and more powerful, I've come to think, than what we've currently got on offer. So we ought to be recovering it. We ought to treat it as buried treasure. We ought to be bringing it to the surface, dusting it down. When we do, we find that much in the historical texts that offer us this moral vision is awful. I mean, they're very sexist, they're very militaristic. We don't have to take the whole package.
No, they might be guideposts or signposts along the way.
Yes, they are aids to thinking outside our own box. And there's a perpetual tendency in philosophy for us to treat our interpretation, our reading of certain concepts as the canonical reading, because it is for us. And once you began to doubt our way of thinking about freedom, which I do, you'd start to doubt other things, because of course all these terms are interconnected and interdefined. You'd start to think differently about rights, you'd start to think differently about equality. So you begin to reshape a moral world for yourself. You're not, of course, replicating a past moral world. You're taking elements from this which you might not have thought about. I would never have thought about this. And trying to reinsert them into our world. And I've come to think that that's a very important part of the intellectual historian's task. In this dialectical relationship between us and the history of our culture, we see very many continuities, of course, and we can focus on them should we choose. But I think it's more valuable to focus on discontinuities, and for two reasons. And one is to do with the contemporary state of philosophy, where, despite efforts to undermine it, which you might think had been philosophically convincing, the fact is that conceptual analysis still reigns, so that questions are asked about how we should really think about freedom, how we should really think about rights, how we should really think about justice. I've come to feel that why we need an historical approach to questions of that kind is that there is no canonical reading to be given of these concepts. Of course, if we're talking about the idea of freedom, we must in some way be talking about human agency and choice. So we must have some common subject matter, but at some level so banal that what's most important is what we erect upon that, what analysis we give of the concept. Now, I'm saying that what has happened in contemporary political philosophy is that an analysis of the concept in terms of negative freedom and absence of interference, and of course interference is a very complex notion, and so is coercion, so you can do the analysis for a very long time. What counts as coercion? What counts as interference? These are not simple questions. You can amuse yourself for a long time here, but what will not emerge is the concept of freedom. What will emerge is a concept, and that can always be confronted with an alternative reading. What makes us think that our way is the canonical way? There's a perpetual tendency for us to isolate a concept, give it an analysis, and treat that as canonical, because of course it then fits into all our other ways of thinking. The role of the intellectual historian in relation to philosophy is continually to try to denature these concepts, continually to try to make you see that what looks like the necessary might be the contingent. And some of the most imaginative intellectual history of our time has been done by people, and indeed, to cite the great name Michel Foucault, using this metaphor of archaeology, the archaeology of knowledge, one of his great texts, to take a concept that you might think it cannot but be a natural concept and could not have a history, and he chose sex, and then began to write the history of sex. And of course the whole thing is socially constructed. How much of our world is socially constructed such that we have various readings of it, and how much is not, is something that he made an absolutely central question for the human sciences. But it's remarkable how we've moved back into, as it seems to me, a phase in which we're not very hospitable to that notion. I would like us to be very hospitable to that notion of how much is socially constructed. A little piece of autobiography which takes us very far back into our conversation, right to the beginning. I'm astonished now by the extent to which, in Wittgenstein's phrase, there was a bewitchment by concepts when I was first of all writing about these questions about freedom in the Renaissance, because the reason I couldn't make sense of it was that I understood freedom to be in some way absence of coercion. That was how I'd been brought up to think about the concept, and so I'm thinking, well, that's what we mean by freedom. So where's the interference here? I can't make sense of what they're saying. So I tried to make sense of what they were saying in the light of a concept which was not their concept. And it wasn't until I came to understand their concept from the inside and contrast it with our, as it looked to me to start with, canonical version of the concept, that I really came to think, well, we have a pluralism here. We simply do. So but there is a clear example. Maybe I'm particularly obtuse, but maybe not. Maybe there is a bewitchment by very powerful concepts so that we make them canonical. And we must not do that.